and then they creep up in between the toes. Usually one doesn't feel them at first, until maybe at some point, especially when one arrives at one's destination, one sits down in the chair, one will feel a little annoying sensation. It could be between the toes. They're usually between the toes. Sometimes they climb up the leg. Sometimes even going as far up to the crotch. And then one feels a little annoying sensation there, and then one looks under the toes or on one's leg, and one sees a stream of blood. And then if one looks carefully, one might see, could be a few inches away from you, even a foot, there'll be something which is now swollen and fat, like a real fat worm, creeping away like an inchworm. And sometimes they're almost a little bit like a suicide bomb. The enjoyment of drinking the blood is enough of a reward for them to risk suicide, so that they get crushed between the toe and the shoe or the thong that you're wearing. And so when you take off your thong or sandal, you'll find a mass of blood on it with the skin, the broken skin of the leech. Okay, so these are some of the things one has to endure. Okay, but there are not only these different types of creeping things, but there's also ill-spoken, unwelcome words. In India during the Buddha's time, the people, not all of the people were respectful of the Buddhist monastics, but sometimes there would be communities which were following one of the other religious groups, which were quite hostile to the Buddhists. Sometimes the Brahmins would abuse and revile the Buddhists, calling them shaven-headed good-for-nothings, baldies, waste parasites on society, outcasts, and so on. So one would get these ill-spoken, unwelcome words, and nowadays it's common experience to be spoken to in this way. Everybody has that. And then come the arisen bodily feelings from illness, from travel, the natural pains of the body. Feelings arise that are painful, racking, sharp, piercing, disagreeable, distressing, menacing to life. And so one has to be able to endure those pains with patience. Okay, then come the taints to be abandoned by avoiding. This is basically prescription for good common sense. So here, reflecting wisely, the monk avoids a wild elephant, a wild horse, a wild bull, a wild dog, a snake, a stump, this would be the stump of a tree which has fallen down, a bramble patch, a chasm, a cliff, a cesspit, a sewer. Reflecting wisely, he avoids sitting on unsuitable seats. These would be sitting together with people that could harm his reputation. Wandering to unsuitable resorts. There would be parts of the city or town which would be the equivalent of what we now call the red light districts. And so the monk should not go walking alone to those areas, because then people, when he starts coming back, people will see him and say, what was that monk doing in the red light district? And associating with bad friends, since if he were to do so, then his wise companions would suspect him of improper conduct. Okay, so these, and then if one acts in this way, then certain taints, vexation, and fever could arise. So these are the taints to be abandoned by avoiding. Then we come to number 6, these are the taints to be abandoned by removing. Or I think a better translation here is dispelling. This is applying methods of dispelling unwholesome thoughts. So what are the taints that should be abandoned by removing or dispelling? Here, reflecting wisely, the monk does not tolerate an arisen thought of sensual desire. He abandons it, removes it, does away with it, and annihilates it, or obliterates it. He does not tolerate an arisen thought of ill will. He does not tolerate an arisen thought of cruelty. These are taken to be the 3 primary types of what are called wrong thought or unwholesome thoughts. Thought of sensual desire, which is rooted in craving or greed. And then thoughts of ill will and thoughts of cruelty, which are rooted in hatred. And so in training the mind, one has to eliminate these unwholesome thoughts. When we come to a later sutta, we're going to see some of the specific methods that the Buddha taught for overcoming and eliminating these unwholesome thoughts. Here, if we just read this text the way it's been recorded, it seems as though the text is prescribing a kind of rather forceful and aggressive method of tackling unwholesome thoughts. But as we will see, the Buddhist texts actually recommend a variety of strategies. Some methods are soft and gentle, other methods are rather forceful. So we could say that the aim is to overcome and dispel these unwholesome thoughts. But the methods themselves are not necessarily forceful and aggressive. Sometimes the best method of overcoming these unwholesome thoughts is a little bit like the judo method. You know, in judo, they say, I've never practiced judo, but the master of judo doesn't use his own bodily strength and force to overcome his opponent, but he lets the opponent attack, and then he bends and yields, seeming to yield, in order to allow the opponent to defeat himself by drawing the strength of the opponent and using that to the opponent's disadvantage so that he overcomes his opponent. Has anybody practiced judo?
That's like Tai Chi.
Well, Tai Chi does
Tai
that.
Chi, same thing.
Yeah.
Right into the wall.
Okay, so some methods are like Tai Chi or judo. That's like the method I explained before. Instead of just trying to directly confront and combat the unwholesome thought, one can just stand by and watch it, not yielding to it, not grasping the thought and allowing it to proliferate, but just by watching it, it exhausts its own strength and then fades away. But I don't want at this point to go into the specific methods, since we're going to deal with that in relation to a later sutta. Okay, now these with taints to be abandoned by removing, this is the last section on what I call provisional methods of abandoning the taints, or methods of actually restraining the taints so that they don't gain power. And so at this point I'll ask whether anybody has any questions on the sections from taints to be abandoned by using up to taints to be abandoned by removing or dispelling. this is actually a comment from somebody who's following on the internet, but it's actually an interesting comment. He says, using focuses on tendencies to craving and grasping pleasant things. Actually, that's true, because one tends to have a craving for clothing, delicious food, luxurious dwelling places. Well, I don't know whether anybody has craving for medicines, but okay. But the first three certainly can be bases for craving. And then he says, enduring, that is in paragraph number 18, focuses on unpleasant things that create aversion and ill will. He says, was this the main intention of those two practices? It's not stated that way explicitly, but I think this brings out the underlying intention of them. So that's quite a good point. Okay. Any questions on any of these sections? Oh, wait.
One thing tends to be abandoned by using part of tends to be abandoned by restraining. Okay.
I didn't quite catch the question. Speak more loudly.
Tends to be abandoned by using, be
By
considered as part of tends to be abandoned by restraining.
Okay, that's a good point. Yeah, actually that's an interesting point, that there's some aspect of restraining involved in using, even though they're counted separately. But when one uses these things like the clothing, food, dwelling place, one has to restrain, the sensory attachment to robes can't be very fancy, but clothing, one has a kind of craving for beautiful, attractive clothing. Well, even there are some types of, I have to tell you, sometimes like monks have some obsession with robes of a particular color. Like, I want the mahogany colored robe. I don't want a robe which is sort of a little bit orange colored like this. And so if somebody offers a robe which is always sort of a brownish orange, no, I don't want this. I put it away and try to trade it with another monk to get the mahogany colored. Or else the story about the alms bowl. There's a little bit of a diversion, but I'll tell it. You see, my early years in Sri Lanka, we were all using the Sri Lankan bowls, which are black bowls made out of, I don't know what kind of metal, but nothing very attractive. Then some monks had gone to Thailand and came from Thailand back to Sri Lanka with these bright, shiny, stainless steel alms bowls. And when there's a line of monks in the dining hall, all of the monks are sitting there with their ordinary black, what do you call this process? They take the bowl, they put oil over it, sesame oil, and then they put it in a fire to glaze it with a coating of burnt sesame oil to protect the metal. Yeah, so that's the Sri Lankan bowl. Then one monk who's been to Thailand comes, sits down maybe at the end of the line with his bright, beautiful stainless steel bowl, and then all the eyes go. And then monk B thinks, I have to go to Thailand. And he goes to Thailand and comes back with a bright, beautiful stainless bowl. And then nobody is satisfied with their black, glazed, ordinary Sri Lankan made bowls. And so now it's hard to find the old style Sri Lankan bowls in Sri Lanka. Everybody has the Thai style bowl. Okay, so one gets the craving for the beautiful things, and those are also things that one uses based on sensory impressions. So there is some degree of sense restraint involved in that. But probably because the things that are used are so prominent in one's day-to-day life that they're put into a separate category. Okay, this comes... Okay, we'll take the question from... I'll take that one question, then I'll have to go on because I want to finish the sutta today.
It seems like many things persist because one gives attention to them.
Because one gets...
One gives attention to them.
One gives attention to them.
Yes. And we think, in terms of particle physics,
Yeah.
things come into being by merely being observed
Yeah.
on this minute level, and they don't exist if one isn't observing them.
Yeah. Yeah.
At the same time, with observing one's obsession
Yeah.
with an object or an irritation or whatever, creates somewhat of a dilemma, because if one is focusing attention on it, then it exists.
Yeah.
But if one is not giving it attention, it doesn't exist.
Yeah. Okay, that's an interesting point, but I think that point will become more relevant later on when we deal with the method of removing the unwholesome thoughts. Okay, this is a question. Since the Buddha singled out medicine and using, under the category of using, can we infer that there was herbal drug abuse by monks even in the Buddha's days? No, I wouldn't say that that's the case, but what's meant by medicinal requisites here, it sometimes is given a broader meaning to include things that one is entitled to use for refreshment after midday. Midday is the cutoff point for the meal, and so one can take proper food after midday, but there are things which the Buddha made allowable, like I said before, honey, oil, butter, and then something is called pani tongue. This is like palm sugar, the sugar of the palm tree, which is taken as a kind of liquid, then it's crystallized, so it becomes, or solidifies, so it becomes a kind of block of hard sugar, which is very delicious because it has the sap of the palm tree. And so these are things which, again, they can become objects of attachment and craving, especially if one's not storing up large quantities of them. Okay, I'll just take this one last question from the internet, then I'll move on and finish the sutta. He says, some of the Thai forest monks go to live alone in the remote areas where there are wild tigers, and they meditate at the edge of tall cliffs to overcome fear. Aren't these against the advice on avoiding here in the sutta? I have to say that seems to me to be the case. Okay, like some of the monks from the Thai forest tradition, if you read the biography of Ajahn Mun and the way of practice of the Dhammadutta monks in Thailand, the ascetic monks, they're encouraged to go out into the wild to meditate in areas where tigers are living, wild elephants, and probably many of them get killed in that environment. But this is their way of sort of testing their fortitude, testing their courage, trying to enter into a battle with fear by going to these fearful places. It seems to me that it's not written that this practice, well, I can admire those who do this for their courage, their determination, but it doesn't seem to me to be in accordance with the spirit of the Buddha's middle way, which is indicated by the passage on avoiding. That's my personal opinion. Okay, I want to go to the last major section of the sutta. These are the taints to be abandoned by developing. So what, as we're going to see, what is meant here by developing is developing the 7 factors of enlightenment. So the text says, here a bhikkhu, reflecting wisely, develops the mindfulness enlightenment factor, which is supported by seclusion, dispassion and cessation, and ripens in or matures in relinquishment. He develops the investigation of states, investigation of phenomena, enlightenment factor. The energy enlightenment factor, the rapture enlightenment factor, the tranquility enlightenment factor, the concentration enlightenment factor, the equanimity enlightenment factor, supported by seclusion, dispassion and cessation, and ripening in relinquishment. Okay, when we see the enlightenment factors described in connection with this additional phrase, supported by seclusion, dispassion and cessation, ripening and relinquishment, this seems to me to suggest that this is a fairly high level in the development of the enlightenment factors, a level at which the enlightenment factors have reached a fair degree of maturity. Because supported by seclusion means that one is now secluding oneself from the defilements of the mind. One is able to overcome, at least temporarily, the pull and the impulsive force of craving and aversion. And one is moving towards dispassion, the ending of attachment. One is moving towards cessation, the cessation of all defilements and all conditioned existence. And this enlightenment factor has gained such power that it's ready to ripen in relinquishment, the letting go of all attachment. And so we have these enlightenment factors, 7 enlightenment factors, unfolding first with mindfulness as the starting point. The way I understand it, one begins with the 4 foundations of mindfulness, the 4 establishments of mindfulness. On this basis, one starts to investigate the qualities of the mind, to distinguish what is unwholesome, what is wholesome, removing the unwholesome, strengthening the wholesome. As one strengthens the wholesome factors, energy increases, the determination to sustain the practice. As that energy increases and the mind settles down, it brings a swelling up of joy or rapture, piti. Initially, rapture, though it's uplifting, blissful, delightful, but it involves a certain, what I call a certain element of disturbance, because there's exhilaration and excitement to it. But as one continues to develop the foundations of mindfulness, the rapture settles down, then the mind enters the state of tranquility. When the mind becomes tranquil, this facilitates the move towards concentration. When concentration matures, it brings equanimity. And then when these 7 enlightenment factors are present together, with the equanimity as the culmination, then one renews the investigation enlightenment factor, and that brings the arising of panya, wisdom or insight. And when that wisdom of insight comes to maturity, then it will eradicate successively the fetters, the latent tendencies, and the taints. And so that's how the development of the 7 factors of enlightenment leads to the 3 higher stages of realization, culminating in the end of all of the defilements. And so now, concluding the discourse, the Buddha says in the last paragraph, when for a bhikkhu among the taints that should be abandoned by seeing have been abandoned by seeing, when the taints that should be abandoned by restraining have been abandoned by restraining, so for the taints that should be abandoned by using, taints that should be abandoned by enduring, taints that should be abandoned by avoiding, taints that should be abandoned by removing, taints that should, when the taints that should be abandoned by developing have been abandoning by developing, then he is called a monk who dwells restrained with the restraint of all the taints. He has severed craving, flung off the fetters, and with the complete penetration of conceit, he has made an end of suffering. Okay, and so that takes us to the end of the discourse. If there's any questions, we could just maybe take 1 or 2 questions and then come back after the meal for the question period. Any questions?
I'd like to know if I'm receiving this.
Okay, please use the microphone.
It seems to me that in a lot of the definitions of things, as which things are to be dealt with in which ways, that he tends to define them by their effects rather than by what they are, which is and I have a hard time telling which kinds of things are supposed to be handled in which ways. Because there's little energy in the text and what the things are.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. It seems that the emphasis here is on, you mean that each section deals with the methods rather than the particular. I think maybe we could see this as some indication of, I just have to conjecture an answer. Maybe this can be seen as an indication of the pragmatic approach of the Buddha's teaching, that the Buddha is concerned with indicating the methods, and the practitioners will know for themselves what are the particular taints, vexations, and fevers that are to be eliminated by these methods. Or it could be the case simply that it was part of like the renunciate culture during the time of the Buddha, that in whatever ascetic community one was practicing, one had a pretty good idea already of what are the factors to be eliminated by the training. And so one knows what one has to overcome, but what is needed are the methods for removing these particular unwholesome mental states. But there are enough suttas in which the Buddha does explain the unwholesome mental states to be eliminated. And we will come to them as we go along. And so it could be that the case that we just can't take one sutta in isolation as though it were the entirety of the Buddha's teaching. But no doubt monks during the Buddha's time, whether monks, lay people, they would have been exposed again and again to different teachings of the Buddha. So they're a little bit like pieces of a jigsaw puzzle that one just has to put together in order to get the whole picture. Okay, I'll just take this internet question, and then we'll do the dedication of merit. And then if anybody has any further questions, please come back at 12 o'clock. Okay, the question, it seems that seeing, that's the practice of seeing, and the method of developing require sitting meditation, whereas restraining, using, and removing are practices in everyday activities. Is this correct? I'd say it's more or less correct, except that when we speak about developing the 7 factors of enlightenment, certainly a large part of the practice will be sitting meditation, but there's also interwoven with sitting meditation, there's also the walking meditation. And so, in fact, some practitioners will give more emphasis to walking meditation, some more emphasis to sitting meditation. But what we can say is that seeing and developing generally occur through a deliberate training in meditation, whereas restraining, using, removing, and so on are broader extensions of the meditative frame of mind to activities in everyday life. Okay, so this will be the class for this morning. I should mention today is October 31st. We won't have a class next Sunday, but the next class will be on November 14th. And that class we will take Sutta number 6. This is called, If a Bhikkhu Should Wish. And this sutta will take us in through the 4 stages of realization, as well as some of the other advanced attainments along the path of practice. And then this will be followed by Sutta number 7. I believe Sutta 6 and 7, Kaidi, are already on the Baos website. So if any of you don't have the textbook, it's now been reissued by Wisdom Publications. I think just this week it came back into print. But if you don't have the textbook and you want to follow the sutta, you can download it off the Baos website. Even if you have the textbook, if you don't want to carry this heavy weight back and forth, you can just print out those pages and bring them to the class. Okay, so please remember that will be November 14th, 9:30 we will have the meditation, 9:30 to 10. But please try to come exactly on time or even a little bit early, because when people start to sit and then the door constantly opens, closes, the creaking sound, it's a little bit like a dog barking. Okay, we'll end with the sharing of the merits. I'll do it in the short style. Akasata Chapumata Deva Naga Mahitika Punyantang Anumodipa Chirang Rakantu Sasanam Akasata Chapumata Deva Naga Mahitika Punyantang Anumodipa Chirang Rakantu Desanam Akasata Chabumata Deva Naga Mahitika Punyantang Anumodipa Chirang Rakantu Mantaram Eta Batacham Hei Sampadam Punya Sampadam Sabbe Devanumodantu Sabbe Bhutanumodantu Sabbe Sadanumodantu Sabba Sampati Siddhya Bhavagupadhaya Vichihetato Etantare Satakayupapanna Rupiya Rupicha Pasanya Sanino Tukha Pamuchantu Pusantu Vibhutin